Okay, welcome. Tonight, we, as a church, Caversham Community Church, we are studying Isaiah, and we're studying Isaiah 7 through 9 this week. And since usually I would have to preach on 3 chapters in one Sunday morning service, it's a bit hard to do. Welcome. Tonight, we, as a church, Caversham Community Church, we are studying Isaiah, and we're studying. Okay, let's start again. Let's begin our study of Isaiah 7 tonight. And this is Jeff Coleman and with Caversham Community Church. Thank you for those who have joined live and online. So I'll pray, and then the plan for tonight is to study or to go over the historical context of Isaiah 7, 8, and 9, which is the reign of Ahaz, the king of Judah. Then we'll talk about a little bit about Assyria and the 2 kings that are attacking Ahaz, which is Pekah of Israel and Rima of Syria. Sorry, I've got that wrong. Well, we'll get there. Rezin. And then we'll jump into Isaiah 7. And go over the whole chapter. So we've got a lot to do. Let's go ahead and get started. So is your heart shaking because of what you are seeing in the news? Are you fearful? Is anything in the world making you fearful at this point in time? When I talk with various people on Facebook or by email or over the phone, a lot of people are concerned about what they read in the news, the information they get on social media. There seems to be news of doom and gloom. We think of COVID and the vaccine and Afghanistan, the rise of China, the fall of the West. Personally, right now, I feel very concerned and sometimes borderline fearful. As Christians, we're not supposed to be afraid of anything. Jesus said, "Fear not." And yet within my soul, I know that when I read things, when I hear things, I do begin to feel afraid. Even though I'm a Christian and I know my ultimate destiny, I still feel afraid. And I think all of us can empathize with that. So the question is, as believers, how do we respond to the news that we receive that makes us fearful? And thankfully, Isaiah 7 through 9, which we're studying at church and in our inductive Bible studies, can give us some answers on this question. So the main point for tonight is keeping our eyes on God. So if we keep our eyes on God and his covenant promises, we have nothing to fear. We can rest in his promises. We can rest in his character and his sovereignty over history. So going back to, and I'll just share my screen now. Let's do a quick review of Isaiah 7, or where we're up to in Isaiah. Isaiah 7 to 9 is really, I'm going to call it the book of Emmanuel. A lot of commentators say that Isaiah 7 through 12 is a distinct section in Isaiah, and a lot of them call it book of Emmanuel because you see that name popping up, Emmanuel, which means God with us, several times throughout the chapters. So the book of Emmanuel. Now, the book theme of Isaiah is salvation through the Messianic king. It's written by Isaiah to Judah and Jerusalem around 700 BC. The message is that the Messianic king, Jesus, will rule in righteousness over a righteous kingdom and the remnant, a righteous remnant from Israel and the nations. So that will happen. But he's got to do a couple things first. First, he has to become a servant and provide righteousness that the remnant doesn't have on their own. Secondly, he's got to conquer the remnant's enemies. And once that's done, then he can begin to rule. And so this is really God's plan for history. The whole Old Testament shows us that we need the Messiah, and Isaiah tells us that he will come. He will be in the line of David. A minority, not a majority, but a minority of people will choose to be on his side. That's the remnant, and it includes the remnant of Israel and the remnant of the Gentile nations, the Goyim. And so that will happen, but he's got to be a servant, and that happens at the first advent, the first coming of Jesus, and he's got to be a conqueror as well, which happens at the second advent. And all this is predicted by Isaiah. We know from chapter 1, verse 1, that Isaiah is writing in the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, who we're going to talk about tonight, Hezekiah, and Manasseh. Contemporary prophets were Hosea and Micah. Hosea was in the northern Israel, the 10 tribes, and Micah was a co-prophet in the south at the same time as Isaiah. And Israel is going to be conquered during Isaiah's lifetime. It's not conquered yet in Isaiah 7, but it's actually, that's kind of the subject for tonight. Is Isaiah is going to give some prophecies to Ahaz, the king of Judah, about what's going to happen to Israel in a few years, and that comes true in Isaiah's lifetime. And Judah narrowly avoids the same fate as the northern tribes in 701 BC when Hezekiah is king. And so that we'll get to that in our study of Isaiah. Isaiah is in 3 big segments. 1 to 39 is the focus on the Messianic king. 40 to 55 is a focus on the servant, and 56 to 66 is a focus on the conqueror. So we are in the first section, the Messianic king, and within that we're in the third sub-segment, which is the book of Emmanuel. And the chapters 1 through 5 were kind of the introduction to the book of Isaiah, condemnation of Judah. And then chapter 6 is kind of its own sub-segment, and that's the call of Isaiah. That's when he sees a vision of God, and the seraphim say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord." And Isaiah gets his call. And then immediately following that is chapter 7, which is our subject for tonight, part of the book of Emmanuel. So tonight we started at 7 tonight. The focus or the title for chapter 7 is Ahaz's Shaky, Breaky Heart. It's courtesy of Billy Ray Cyrus, right? And chapter 8, tomorrow morning, is going to be Sanctuary or Stone of Offense. And then tomorrow night at 7, A Child is Born. So we'll cover 1 chapter per session. Remember that and here's our famous Lindsay Martin. I don't think Lindsay ever thought he would be on YouTube, but here he is on YouTube. Remember in Isaiah, in each chapter, we're looking for one of the 5 R's, one or more of the 5 R's is going to be in every chapter, and there we have it. So we're going to see Ahaz's rebellion, but we're also going to see promises about the Messiah to come, which is redemption and restoration. And remember that Isaiah, he's a prophet. He's often talking about the future, but you have to determine based on the context, which future, is it a near term? Is it in the prophet's own time? Is it the Babylonian captivity? Is it Cyrus and the restoration? Or is it Jesus' first or second coming? So you don't really know until you look at the context. So we'll always want to keep this graph here in mind as we're reading Isaiah. And Isaiah can switch one verse, and we're going to see that tonight in chapter 7. One verse he can be talking about Christ's first coming. Then the next verse he can go back to his own time very quickly, and you've got to stay with him, otherwise you're going to get lost. And don't forget Dr. Spiegel's graph here, where progressively throughout the prophecy of Isaiah, there's little details about the coming kingdom, and they add up. And we've already covered 2 of those in Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 4. So tomorrow night, when we get to Isaiah 9, we're going to get a bigger or fuller picture of the coming kingdom, which is still future to us. So we've got Isaiah 2, Isaiah 4, Isaiah 9. So if you look at that kind of darkish blue color, and it will tell you what we're going to learn in Isaiah 9. Yellow, Isaiah 4, matches the yellow color and so forth. So really good graph by Dr. Spiegel. Okay, so now we are going to talk about the historical background of chapters 7 through 9. And we're going to talk about Assyria. We're going to talk about Tiglath-Pileser III, Rezin of Syria, Pekah of Israel, and Ahaz of Judah. So I'm going to go to a different slideshow here, which is Assyria. This is pretty cool. Lots of pictures. So Assyria was a, hold on. There we go. So Assyria, this is a, I've got this, I can't, this is Sargon II. This is from Sargon II's temple. Sargon II was the king of Assyria early in Hezekiah's reign. And this is called a lamassu. And you can see it's a bull's body with a Assyrian king's head. And he's got like kind of angel wings as well. So this was a common motif in Assyria. Now Assyrians loved their beards. One of the things I noticed when I first came to New Zealand is that if you're a baby boomer, you quite likely shave either all of your face or you might have a mustache, right? So baby boomers they don't wear beards in New Zealand. But if you're Gen X or millennial, what's the likelihood that you have a beard like this lamassu? It goes up exponentially. So there's some generation gap when it comes to facial hair in New Zealand. But the Assyrians, they definitely like their beard. So you'll see a beard in almost every picture. So this is ancient Nineveh. This is what it looks like today, generally speaking. I don't know how old this picture is. It looks a little bit dated, but you get the point. It's there's nothing there. There's no city called Nineveh anymore. It is close to the present day city of Mosul, which we heard a lot about in the Iraq War. But it is in present day Kurdistan, northern Iraq. It's raised up like that because there are several layers. Nineveh would get destroyed and then it would get rebuilt, and that happened several times. And so that would add up, that would raise the level of the city more and more. Plus it would be easier to defend if it was on a high point. So that is the site of ancient Nineveh. You can go there today. Way back before Abraham, or when Abraham was born, he came from Ur down by the Persian Gulf. But this is the old empire of Assyria. Assyria's had in history had three main golden ages. This is the first golden age. And if you see on the Tigris River, you see a city called Ashur and Nineveh. And try to find them there on the Tigris River. Ashur, that is where the name Assyria comes from. And further upriver, closer to the mountains, is Nineveh. So those were the two main cities and always have been, of the Assyrian Empire. So this is the first Assyrian Empire, the old Assyrian Empire. And then next we have this is around the time of Moses and Joshua. And you can see Assyria in yellow there next to the Mitanni in brown and the Kassite or Babylonians in gray. But the Assyrians are there in kind of a yellow color. You see Nineveh and Ashur. So this is around Moses's time. This is the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So you can see that in 824 BC, it was large, and much larger even than the old or middle Assyrian empires. And you see Nineveh there with a red dot. But you can see that between 824 and 671, there was astronomical growth in the Assyrian Empire. They basically took over the entire Middle East. And this is the context for Isaiah 7. It was Isaiah 7 takes place in 734 BC, 734 BC. So what is happening in Isaiah 7 is Assyria is taking over. I mean, they are just, the Middle East has not seen anything like this before. I think it's safe to say that at the time, this was the greatest and largest empire possibly that the world had ever seen up to that time. So imagine the fear, and you see Judah is an outpost surrounded by the Assyrian Empire. And you can imagine the fear that would encompass the king and the population with this blitzkrieg, this mighty army of Assyria, even conquering Egypt. I mean, that's a long ways to go from Nineveh to Egypt, and yet they had such a good army and such good provisions and supplies that they could take over the entire Middle East. So this, let's bring it into our own day. We're sitting in New Zealand. We think we're safe and secure. And I'm not saying this is going to happen. So I'm not a prophet or anything. I'm just saying it would be something like China taking over Australia, Japan, basically the entire Pacific, Indonesia, and New Zealand would be next. New Zealand would be like Judah, surrounded by a Chinese ocean or something like that. So imagine the fear if that was really what life was like in New Zealand, if you were surrounded by a cruel, and Assyria was known as a cruel empire. This is an artist's depiction of what Nineveh might have looked like. You see the walls, temples, courtyards, magnificent city, a large population. You need wheat, so you need a high degree of agriculture to feed a city like this, and you would have that on the Tigris Plain. So this is Tiglath-Pileser. This is the king that expanded the Assyrian Empire the most. Notice the beard, and he has a watch on. It looks like a wristwatch. So this is Tiglath-Pileser the third. He was an amazing administrator, an amazing general. And the Assyrians, on their rampage, they basically took no prisoners. You see, this is from one of their palaces, and a lot of interesting things in this picture. You see they're besieging the city. You see walls. You see a ladder that they've got ladders to get up on top of the wall. They've got archers. And notice the impaled enemy there on posts, and people falling and getting struck down by the Assyrians. So they were a fierce army. Nothing like them had ever been seen before in the Middle East. They were incredibly effective warriors, and they glorified themselves in battle. I mean, this isn't cheap. This artistry on this wall, they obviously are very proud of their military prowess, because again and again we find images like these on their walls. So they almost proud of their gruesomeness, of their brutality. Again and again, the walls look like this. So this is really, it looks like crucifixion in many ways. So imagine the fear. Again, this all goes back to fear. This is the people that Ahaz is dealing with, that Judah is dealing with. Jehu was an earlier king of Israel, and we actually have evidence that he paid tribute to an earlier king. Actually, let's see. I can't read my own captions because it's blocked. Does that say Tiglath-Pileser III? I think it does. But this is Jehu, a king of Israel, bowing and kissing the ground before the Assyrian king. And the words that go, the caption that goes along with this picture, you read it right there. It's talking about Jehu. So this is an actual king of Israel prostrating himself before the king of Assyria. So this it confirms the Bible, and it also tells you that Assyria was unstoppable. So, and this is Sennacherib. So this is another direct biblical reference or confirmation. Remember when Sennacherib sends the Rabshakeh to Hezekiah and says, "You're next. You know, we've defeated all these kingdoms. You're next." Well, here the Bible tells us he's at Lachish. Sennacherib's at Lachish, and he sends the Rabshakeh to Jerusalem. Well, this says that Sennacherib ordered the city of Lachish to be slaughtered. So this is a direct, again, biblical confirmation. It tells you that the Old Testament is trustworthy. They were really into lion hunts, the kings were. And so this is an extraordinarily detailed bas relief, isn't it? It's great art. I mean, look at the lion, look at the muscles in the lion. I mean, this is well-developed art. Very impressive. And it shows you how the kings of Assyria thought of themselves, you know, as powerful, as lion killers. The prism on the left is how they kept records. And this is Sennacherib's prism. This is the king of Assyria when Hezekiah, laid out the papers before the Lord in the temple. This is his very prism. So it's amazing what archaeologists discover and how it's so close to what we find in the Bible. Really amazing. And so here's another picture of how the Assyrian Empire grew. And notice, why is it that Jerusalem is the only outpost able to maintain independence in this vast Assyrian Empire? You see the red circle around Jerusalem, and if you look up at the key of the map, it says Jerusalem, Judah, is a free zone within Assyria. It's the only free zone in the entire empire. It's the same thing we saw in the earlier map. See that yellow part? That's the free zone. Judah was able to maintain its independence in an Assyrian sea. Why is that, I wonder? Is it because what we read in Isaiah and 2 Kings about Hezekiah's prayer and the destruction of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers outside the walls of Jerusalem by the angel of the Lord might actually have happened? Why else would the king of Assyria let Judah remain kind of the center of freedom within its empire? Wouldn't make any sense. Amazing historical confirmation of what we read. Okay, and then when Assyria finally took over Samaria, this is the blue arrow. This is 725 BC. So this is about 10 years after Isaiah 7. This is when northern Israel is wiped off the map, and they are deported all the way back to Babylonia. And the blue and green. Yes, the blue arrow is the direction where Tiglath-Pileser, or actually no, it would have been Shalmaneser V, took the northern Israelis, the northern Israelites, away from Israel and scattered them all the way to Media and other places. So this is the first deportation by Assyria, and then the Assyrians brought Babylonians into Israel, and they became the Samaritans. They were kind of half Jewish, half Babylonian, and in Jesus' day, that's why there was such a bad blood between the Jews and the Samaritans, because the Jews looked down on the Samaritans as half Jews. They had Babylonian blood and Jewish blood. They weren't really Jewish. And so, they had their own gods, their own Pentateuch and whatnot. And that was because of the Assyrians. The Assyrians are the ones who brought them in there to the land. And here again, we see Jerusalem and Judah is the only free area in the Assyrian Empire, that the heartland of Judah in orange there. So they were able to maintain their independence. Okay, so that's pretty neat stuff. Wow, I always run out of time. Okay, so let's go back to here. So let's talk about the three. So that's Assyria and Tiglath-Pileser III. Let's talk about Pekah and Rezin. So Pekah of Israel, he murdered Pekahiah, the previous king of Israel, at Samaria. And we're told about this in 2 Kings 15. And he then seized the throne and he reigned about 6 years. And he adopted an anti-Assyrian policy. Let me see. Let me pull up another map here. Yeah, this will help. So he's the king of Israel, the northern kingdom, and he lives in Samaria. You should be able to see Samaria there, one of the stars, close to Shechem and Tirzah. So he lives there, and he adopts a anti-Assyrian policy. So what he does is he bands together with Aram, and see Aram in green there. So Israel and Aram form an alliance. And the reason they form alliance is because they're worried about Assyria. Assyria is coming. And if they don't work together, they're both going to be destroyed. So they band together. And Rezin is the king of Aram. He's in Damascus, which is up off the map there. And so when they form an alliance, they're worried about what's behind them. And one of the rules of warfare is you don't want to fight on two fronts, right? Germany attacked France in World War II, hoping to kick France out of the war so that she could move all of her troops to the Eastern Front and then take over Russia. And they were pretty successful at that for a while. They did defeat France very quickly and then moved many troops over to the Russian front. They didn't want to fight a two-front war like they did in World War I. Well, same thing here. Israel and Aram are worried about Assyria from the north, so they want to firm up what's happening in the south. So that causes them. Now, meanwhile, Ahaz is sitting in Jerusalem. He's like, wait a minute, Aram and Israel are coming after me. I need to form an alliance with Assyria to get these guys to back off. Otherwise, they're going to take over Judah and kill me and put a puppet ruler on the throne. And that's what we see in Isaiah 7. So that's why Ahaz is afraid. So Ahaz has a choice to make. He can either trust in God or he can try to make a deal with the king of Assyria. And of course, you know what he does. He tries to make a deal with the bearded guy, Tiglath-Pileser III. Humanly speaking, you can see why he would do that. But a king of Judah from the line of David isn't supposed to make decisions based on human viewpoint, but based on divine viewpoint. And that's why Isaiah gets after him as the prophet. So Ahaz appeals to Tiglath-Pileser III. And for a while, it looks like his plan works because the Assyrians actually capture Damascus, the capital of Aram, in 732 BC. And they also invade Israel and take over most of Galilee. So you see the Sea of Galilee there. So in Tiglath-Pileser's first invasion, Aram basically is wiped off the map. Damascus is taken, and also half of Israel is taken, including Galilee. So archaeology confirms this in Tiglath-Pileser's own historical annals and excavations at Hazor. Now you can see Hazor there is between Lake Hule and the Sea of Galilee. See Hazor? It's in Israel, but there's actually archaeological evidence that around this time, an army came and sacked and pillaged that city to the ground and burned it to the ground. So again, a confirmation from archaeology. And when Assyria came down and took over Aram and most of Israel, or half of Israel, they instituted, or they took Pekah off the throne and slew him, basically. And they put a puppet king, Hoshea, on the throne. So now the king of Israel is basically a puppet king, and he pays tribute to Assyria. Rezin, there's not much to say about Rezin. He was basically destroyed by this Assyrian army, and Aram was wiped off the map. So then we have Ahaz. Ahaz truly is one of the worst kings in Judah's history. Possibly, I think it's fair to say, the second worst. Manasseh is probably the worst, but Ahaz is a close second. He was 20 years old, and we did quite a bit of work in our PUP studies on this, from 2 Kings 16 and 2 Chronicles 28. And you would know this as well as I. He was 20 years old when he began to rule. He ruled 16 years, from about 732 to 715 BC. His name, Ahaz, is an abbreviated form of Jehoahaz. So his full name would be Jehoahaz, but he went by Ahaz. And his name is confirmed by an inscription of Tiglath-Pileser III. So he did not do what was right in God's eyes, but walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He made metal images for the Baals. He burned his sons as an offering in the valley of the son of Hinnom, which is south of Jerusalem, just as the Canaanites did. So can you imagine? He's in the line of David. He's a recipient of the Davidic covenant as a son of David sitting on the throne, and he's burning his sons, who are also in the line of David, in this valley that will later be known as Gehenna, or hell in Jesus' day. So this is evil. This is really bad stuff. This is a son of David, someone in the line of David, killing his own sons, making them pass through this ritual fire as an offering to gods that aren't even real. This is really, really bad stuff. He worshipped idols on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree, and he made Judah act sinfully. So we're told in 2 Kings 16 that God humbled Judah as a result of Ahaz, and he sent Rezin of Syria and Pekah of Israel against him, but they could not conquer him. Rezin recovered Elath in the Gulf of Aqaba, and at the same time, you see Edom there and Philistia. So at the same time that Israel and Aram were attacking Judah from the north, Philistia took advantage of the situation and attacked from the west, and Edom attacked from the south. So Ahaz is getting attacked from 3 directions by 4 different countries, and he's making a deal with Assyria, who later will take over the whole area. So he is out of options. If he doesn't turn to the Lord, he is not it's not going to turn out well for him. So we're told that Pekah struck him and killed 120,000 Judahites in one day, and took 200,000 captive to Israel. But through the prophet Oded and 4 chiefs of Ephraim, those captives were returned to Judah. So that's quite interesting. That's in 2 Chronicles 28. So Edom is attacking, the Philistines are attacking, and so Ahaz turns to Tiglath-Pileser for help. This is when Isaiah steps in Isaiah 7, but Ahaz refuses to take Isaiah's advice. And he actually took items from the temple in Jerusalem to give tribute to Tiglath-Pileser, but it didn't help him. Tiglath-Pileser marched against Damascus, took it, carried its people captive, and killed Rezin the king. He then came against Israel and later Judah. So the price of Assyrian aid, besides being a heavy drain on the government's income and coffers, became really a century of being a vassal state to the king of Assyria. So, but Ahaz really he wasn't the type of king that would really learn his lesson. He became more unfaithful to God after all of this. He went to Damascus, and this is just incredible. He went to Damascus, which had just been conquered by Tiglath-Pileser, and to meet him. And he saw this new Assyrian altar that the Assyrians built in Damascus now that it was their city. And he perhaps as part of the agreement to be the vassal to the king of Assyria, he agreed to set up an Assyrian altar in Jerusalem. And so he sees this altar in Damascus, and he sends a detailed model to Uriah the priest back in Jerusalem and orders Uriah to build the altar before he returns from Damascus. So Uriah the priest follows his instructions, and when Ahaz returns to Jerusalem, he sees this new altar, this new Assyrian altar to the Assyrian gods, and he makes the horrible decision of taking the bronze altar that's always been there since the days of Solomon, and he moves that bronze altar to the north in the temple courtyard. He moves it. It should be right in front. It should be bronze altar, bronze laver, then and then walk up the steps, past the 2 pillars, and into the holy place, into the temple. But Ahaz says, no, I don't want this type of worship anymore. I want to put the Assyrian altar in the prominent place. So he moves the Jewish altar, the altar to Yahweh, to the north, and he puts the Assyrian altar there in the middle. He does some other things to some of the other tools and other vessels there in the temple compound. He cuts them in pieces. He takes the sea, which is the basin where the priests would wash. He takes the sea from off the bronze oxen and puts it on a stone pedestal. He makes a covered walkway between the palace, his own palace, and the temple. He shuts up the doors of the temple. He makes altars in every corner of Jerusalem, and he makes high places to other gods in every city of Judah. So he's basically changing the entire religious way of life for Judah, because of his fear of Assyria, but also seems like he wants to. He probably believes that the Assyrian gods are more powerful than Yahweh, the God of Israel, at this point. And so Judah just God is not happy. He's not a happy camper, and he sends Isaiah to give Ahaz a strict warning in Isaiah 7-9. So Judah's decline during this period in the late 8th century BC is due largely to Ahaz's lack of faith. According to the rabbis, this isn't in scripture, but the Jewish rabbis in various writings say that Ahaz persisted in his wickedness despite all the trials that he received and would not repent. He was just hard-hearted and would not change his mind. He closed the schools and houses of worship so that no instruction in the Torah was possible. Isaiah, we're told in some of the writings, had to teach his disciples in secret because of Ahaz's policies, which is interesting because I think in Isaiah 8 we hear Isaiah tells, "Seal up this word among my disciples." So that could be a reference to his little school. Those who want to remain true to Yahweh are coming around Isaiah for training and instruction, and Isaiah is teaching them. So he has maybe a small school, a secret school of followers of Yahweh, disciples. So we may be coming to that in New Zealand. And so, this is interesting. How did Hezekiah, who was Ahaz's son, how did he avoid being thrown in the valley of Hinnom? How did he avoid being offered to Moloch or some of the other Canaanite or other gods? Well, there's a legend, or we're told in Sanhedrin 63b, which is I think part of the Talmud or Mishnah, that Ahaz's wife Avi saved the life of Hezekiah, whom Ahaz has designated as an offering to Moloch. And so she was able to save Hezekiah's life through her brave act. Now, that's not in the Bible, but it seems, if Ahaz was offering his sons to Moloch or making them, offering them to the gods through some kind of ritual, why did Hezekiah survive? Well, yeah, it probably took some intervention there. And Hezekiah, we will find out in Isaiah, was an extraordinarily good king. And how, the question comes up, how did he become so good when his father was so bad? Who poured into his life? Who mentored him? Who encouraged him in the ways of God? And whoever that was deserves a lot of credit. Maybe Isaiah had something to do with it. We're not told. So in archaeology, let's go back up. Yeah, this is really interesting. This seal has been discovered. I should have put the dates there, but this is actually King Ahaz's seal. It has been discovered, and I think it's in a private collection somewhere in Israel. But this is actually Ahaz's seal. It actually says Ahaz, son of Joash. So that was Ahaz's father. So we actually have confirmation that Ahaz actually lived, and this is his seal. Another interesting thing, I don't want to spend too long on this, but in the notes for this lesson, I found today an article that suggests that cannabis, I don't know how they found it, but apparently they found evidence that cannabis was being used during this time around temples or high places in Ahaz's reign. So the question may be asked, was King Ahaz smoking dope as he was instituting this crazy religious system and blending sort of the Jewish religion or the Old Testament practices with Assyrian gods and other gods. So yeah, so basically this article says ancient Israelite cannabis altar points to King Ahaz's worship. So that's in the show notes for tonight. Quite interesting. Let me check the time here. Oh, we're out of time. We didn't even get to Ahaz's shaky heart, but let's stop there. We just don't have enough time. I can go on and on for hours and hours, and you don't want that. So I'll just end with this. In Isaiah 7, we have 5 paragraphs. The first paragraph is Ahaz's shaky, breaky heart. And then we have don't sweat the small stuff, shattering of Syria and Israel, sign of Messiah's virgin birth, and 4 in that days. If we look at the first 2 verses, there's Pekah and Rezin are coming from the north. We've talked about that. And we're told in verse 2 that the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. We opened tonight by talking about what is shaking people up today. And so this really applies to us as Christians. When we hear bad news, when things are coming against us, when we're feeling afraid and worried, is our heart going to shake like Ahaz and the people, or are we going to be firm in the Lord? The next paragraph is don't sweat the small stuff. God's message to Ahaz is, and he sends Israel to the conduit of the upper pool, where Hezekiah will later be met by Isaiah. It's in the exact same spot. And this is a place of testing. Ahaz is probably there examining Jerusalem's water supply because he expects Jerusalem to be besieged by Syria and Israel. So that's why he's there. And Isaiah meets him. And Isaiah says, he has a message from God. He says, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint. Does that speak to you? Do those instructions apply to you as you're looking out, as you're reading the news, as you're dealing with a kind of a fear of what's going to happen next? God's message to us is to be careful, be quiet, do not fear, don't let your heart be faint. I like the be quiet. Just be quiet. And notice what God says. The Rezin and Pekah, they're nothing. In a couple years, you won't even remember their names. Don't worry, don't sweat the small stuff. Is in the next paragraph, Syria and Israel are going to be shattered. In fact, in 65 years, Ephraim won't even be a people group anymore. They're going to be so scattered and shattered that in 65 years. Now, why 65 years? Because we know Assyria takes over Ephraim or northern Israel only 10 years or about 10 to 12 years later. Well, in 669 BC, the king of Assyria at that time, that's when they brought in tons of Babylonians and other folks all the way from Mesopotamia in the Middle East and Mesopotamia, and brought them over and settled them in Israel. That's when the Samaritans got going. So this prophecy, again, we see another prophecy coming true. This is in 669, 65 years later. So Isaiah's message for Ahaz is you need to be firm in faith. He keeps using the plural you because he's talking not just to Ahaz, but Ahaz is kind of a representative of the entire house of David. And so he's basically talking to Ahaz and everyone after Ahaz, everyone who sits on that Davidic throne. He's saying, you need to be firm in faith. You are you're carrying the fire. You're on the throne of David, and you're not the Messiah, but the Messiah is in your line. So you need to have faith in the Davidic. If anyone needs to have faith in the Davidic covenant, it's the one sitting on the Davidic throne in every generation. So be firm in faith. And then we have the sign of Messiah's virgin birth. So God tells Ahaz, ask for a sign. Ahaz says no. And then God says, okay, you don't want a sign? I'll give you a sign. I'll give you an amazing sign. Verse 14, I will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin, the Alma, shall conceive and bear a bane, a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. Matthew cites this when he discusses, I think in Matthew chapter 2, or maybe even in Matthew chapter 1, where he's talking about the virgin birth of Yeshua, the virgin birth of the Messiah. This must be a prophecy, a messianic prophecy, that the Messiah will be born of a virgin and that he will be God and man. He's Emmanuel. So this is a prophecy, and Matthew picks up on this and cites this in his gospel. So this is Jesus. So the son in verses 14 and 15 are a reference to the future Messiah. What a lot of people get tripped up on is in the next two verses, there's a boy, and that boy seems to be Isaiah's son, Shahar-Jashub. And I think they're right. So basically 14 and 15 are talking about a future son, and 16 and 17 are talking about a present son, Isaiah's son. And remember, we learned earlier that Sha'ar-Jashub is coming with Isaiah to the conduit, that's flowing in the valley there. And Sha'ar-Jashub means a remnant shall return. So the sign is that before Sha'ar-Jashub gets to the age of accountability, Syria and Israel are going to be gone. So this is the clock is ticking for the northern two threats to Ahaz. And so Ahaz doesn't need to worry about them, but he does need to worry about something else, and that is the king of Assyria. So the chapter ends with 4 in that days, and these in that days refer to Isaiah's own lifetime. They're not far away in that days. They're not talking about the second coming or anything like that. They're talking about what's going to happen in Isaiah's lifetime and during Ahaz's reign. So in that day, Yahweh will whistle for the fly, which is the Egyptian army, and the bee, which is the Assyrian army. And they're going to come and just basically occupy all of Judah. And that's what they in fact do. So 18 and 19 are talking about military occupation. Verse 20 is the next in that day. And here the focus is what is the shame that the king of Assyria is going to bring upon Judah. Shaving of the beard with a razor is a way to humiliate people in the ancient world. And so Yahweh's going to use the king of Assyria as a razor. He's going to shave the beard of Judah and shame them and humiliate them through Assyria for turning away from him. The third in that day has to do with the remnant of Israel. So the few that do love Yahweh, that remain faithful, they're not going to have much, but they're going to have enough. And they're actually going to have curds and honey, which was really usually food for kings, food for the upper class. And so these everyday folk that still love God, they're going to have an abundance of milk and eat curds and have honey. This is talking about the remnant. So during this divine discipline of Israel, when we have military occupation and humiliation, we're going to have provision for the remnant. And God always works that way. And as believers today in New Zealand, we're minority, very much a minority, but we're like the remnant. We are the ones God's looking after. And that's another reason why we don't have to fear. God is going to take care of us no matter what happens in greater society. He's going to be with us, and we're going to have a surprising abundance. We won't lack. That's such a good promise to cling to. And then finally, the last in that day is briars and thorns, economic devastation. One of you mentioned when we were talking earlier about worrying about what's going to happen to the worldwide economy. What's going to happen to the economy of New Zealand with COVID and everything. Well, that same issue was there for Judah. The vines that were worth lots of money and brought in a lot of income to Judah through their through wine and through other agricultural goods that they would produce. That's going to be gone. That's going to be gone, and it's going to be filled with briars and thorns. You see briars and thorns, I think 2 or 3 times in that one paragraph. Yeah, you see it once in verse 23, once in verse 24, and once in verse 25. You know, out here at the farm, you don't want gorse to get out of control because it will take over and you won't have any sheep pasture any longer. And that's what's going to happen here in Judah. So because of Ahaz and his rebellion against God, which we've talked about in detail tonight, there's going to be 4 things that happen. There's going to be military occupation, humiliation, provision for the remnant, and economic devastation. Okay, folks, that's it for tonight. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. at the same Zoom link. So we'll keep using this Zoom link. And don't forget, tomorrow night at 7 p.m., we'll do Isaiah chapter 9. So Isaiah 8 and Isaiah 9 tomorrow. Let's pray. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for history and how everything comes together in the Bible, that the Bible is true. And it gives us hope and confidence as the minority Christian group in New Zealand and wherever we are. It gives us hope that you are looking after us, that we have nothing to fear. Help us not to be shaking in our boots like Ahaz, to have a shaky, breaky heart, but to be firm in our faith and to have confidence in your covenant promises. In Jesus' name, amen.